LFL is the strongest ERL. In the previous two splits of EU Masters, Carmine Corp won both of them, and even currently, in playoffs of EU Master, there are 3 teams from LFL, which is the most of any region. However, what people often don't think about is that there are a lot of challenges coming from the top region that might handicap them in comparison to weaker regions. I was on both ends of the spectrum. I was on the underdog EBL team, trying to make it out of planes in spring 2019, but I was also on the giant from LFL in spring 2021 who failed to make the group stage. Through those experiences, I gained a bit of perspective on certain aspects of the game, on certain aspects of how regions operate, and I would like to share them with you today. So, when you play in LFL or you play in Superliga, generally what you do is you watch LEC, you watch LPL, you watch LCK, and then you see what they play, and then you start playing the same picks. And what's more to that is that it's not just you. Generally, most of the teams from your league start playing the same picks. And to add even more onto that, it's not that you all share the same champion pool, generally, but it's also that you generally don't go for a crazy playstyle. So what I mean by this is you go for the compositions that are proven, and then you play a playstyle that is proven. You don't do anything crazy. You can do some level 1 scouting and surprise your enemy if you see an opening for it. But what you're not going to do is you're probably not going to change your whole pathing completely and then sit in brush in bot lane for 1 minute just to get a cheesy gank off. And this means you're not doing it, other teams are generally not doing it, especially if they're not desperate to qualify. And this means you're not ready for it, right? Because then, let's say you qualify from Superliga to EU Masters, and you play in group stage and you play against an Italian team. And this Italian team has been playing completely different kind of teams for this whole time. They have been playing against weird champions in weird positions, and they are more willing to do something crazy because they understand on paper they are weaker. On paper they shouldn't be winning. But you also understand that you are stronger, so you should probably play the safer style. So you do the safe thing. You're easier to predict. As to what you're going to do, and this means you're easier to cheese. So they prepare something crazy. They prepare a crazy draft, and then they also do something crazy level 1. And generally speaking, it will not work. Generally speaking, if you're the better team, you just defuse the situation, you get a small advantage because they try to cheese you, and you start snowballing the game from there, and you just win. But there will be this 1 out of 1,000, maybe even 100, maybe even 1 out of 10 situation where their cheese actually works, and they have a composition that is snowbally, and they start going and rolling and rolling, and you can't stop them anymore, and they just win the game, and it's a BO1, and you just lost. This also ties to another point that Vetran was making this split of EU Masters. He was actually saying that Superliga teams are looking better because they had Bison as one of the top teams. Bison was a good team that also had a surprising playstyle. They played a lot of different champions, on a lot of different roles, and they were very unpredictable, and they did really challenge other Superliga teams. So Vetran's assumption was that while LFL is playing a completely standard playstyle and struggling to win against tank tops because they can't adjust their drafts, Superliga was getting really challenged by this single team that was really pushing everyone else forward. This meant that he was expecting the teams from Superliga to be more prepared. Even though you might be playing meta champions, you still have a preference. You still have a playstyle that you prefer to play. You might like to play certain champions more than others. You might like to play more aggressive in mid lane and contribute more resources there. I think an interesting example of this was BDS in spring 2021 LFL, where early on in the season they figured out a very interesting playstyle where they would be playing mid lane jungle with an AD mid who would be getting prio permanently, and they would keep invading in very creative ways. And this did give them a lot of early wins. Later on they adjusted, they started playing Graves, and they kept invading, playing aggressively, finding interesting jumps to invade the enemy jungle. But once this playstyle was figured out, they started having a bit more trouble playing it, and they started having a bit more trouble adjusting. And what ended up happening is that they didn't really find their footing at least fully until the very end, and they lost in playoffs and they dropped out of the race. What's very interesting about this case is that they couldn't keep their playstyle because if they kept it, they would keep losing. However, if they qualified to EU Masters with the same playstyle, they probably would do very, very good, just because it would be new teams who didn't figure them out, a lot of weaker teams, and they probably would be easily able to go to playoffs and then potentially do some damage even there. But just because they played in LFL and they got figured out and they had to redo themselves, recreate how they play, this meant that they didn't even qualify to EU Masters, where they could have been one of the better teams. A very similar situation happened to Misfits Premier in this very split. They seem like one of the best teams. They are definitely better than many teams that qualified to EU Masters this split. But because only 4 teams qualified from LFL, they turned out to not be one of the 4. And even though they could have been one of the great challengers, maybe to even compete for the title, because they didn't pick themselves up fast enough in the season, this meant that they just don't qualify and they can't compete. ERL players are also generally not as experienced. So what I mean here is that even if you play for a great team like Team BDS Academy this split, who have a lot of experienced players like Zico and Crownshot, there are still certain aspects of the team and certain players that are not as experienced. So for example, in the BDS Academy team there is Shio, right? I don't know him personally, maybe it's not the case for him, but younger players generally tend to have a bit more trouble playing under pressure. And when the push comes to shove, and you need to survive and you need to win the next game, it is generally better for newer players to be the underdog in this situation. However, if you come from the LFL, if you come from Superliga, and you're playing an Italian team, you should be winning, right? There's no excuse for you. You're not the underdog. You need to be winning. You need to be the better player. And this mentality can actually be a bit of a challenge to overcome for a lot of younger players. At the same time, this is a time for a new player to actually prove themselves. If you can survive under this pressure and show that you don't have to be the underdog to win, but you can be the winner and keep winning, this is what separates the good from the best. Getting just a single win in LFL is much more costly than getting a single win in Italy, in EBL, in Ultraliga. What I mean by this is, if you want to win and you want to make sure that you qualify to EU Masters, you need to put a lot of more time into preparing for every single team that you play in a regular season, but also playoffs, than you would have to do in lower level leagues. If you're the top team in Italy, you don't have to prepare as much. You should be just winning games easily, make sure that you stay on top, make sure that you win the league, and make sure that you qualify. But you don't really have to scout every single team, because the level disparity is generally much higher than in LFL or Superliga. This means that once LFL and Superliga teams come to EU Masters, there is a higher level of burnout and exhaustion. And, some people might say, yeah, it should be enough to pump you up. You're in EU Masters. Come on, like that's what you've been fighting for the whole season. But also keep in mind, the team is not just a single person. It's 5 players and the coaching staff. Even if the coaching staff is not keeping up and the players are doing good, just single player out of the 5, if he's getting exhausted, if he's getting tired, if he can't keep going, if he can't keep grinding, what starts happening is he starts dragging the team down, and it's very difficult to bounce back from this. Especially for teams that go, for example, through planes, because there's so many games, one after another, assuming you just finished playoffs, now you have to go to planes, you need to play for all those teams. Keep in mind, you might get surprised with those crazy picks, right? You still need to do a lot of scouting on a completely new team, and you need to adjust to a completely new team. There's a lot of exhaustion that can be put onto you just because you're coming from one of the top leagues. And here, I will just add a bit of an annoying point that people often don't want to acknowledge. But it's not that big, but it's definitely a factor. If you're in LFL or in Superliga, generally the fan bases are much bigger. This means that commitments to advertising and to doing media stuff is just higher. You need to spend more time taking pictures, maybe even posting something or going to shoots than you would have to do in other leagues. It takes your time. It can make it more difficult to schedule proper training. It's a small factor, but it definitely contributes. In addition to media commitments, just because you have a higher fan base, it might put some additional pressure on players. As I said, younger ones are probably more, are more potent to feel the pressure from the number of fans. An interesting thing is, at least in my experience, is that the higher the number of fans, the bigger impact it has on the management. And sometimes management can start having unreasonable expectations of the team just because the fans are putting so much pressure on the management. The management feels the need to start expecting something crazy. And this can turn into like a very vicious cycle of trying to push yourself, even though you can't really push yourself that much, no matter what you do. In the end, it's important to acknowledge one more thing. All of the things I talked about can have a positive outcome, right? They generally also have a positive side to them. Because you're playing in higher level competition, your level also gets higher. You might not qualify to EU Masters, but once you qualify, you should be able to compete for a number one slot, just because the level of competition was so much higher. Just because there is much more pressure on you, you're also able to showcase yourself, and you're actually able to prove yourself, truly prove yourself, that you are able to thrive under pressure, and you're able to be the winner without having to be the underdog, and you can actually prove it to everyone else. So keep in mind, it is an interesting perspective to talk about the difficulties, and I think people don't talk about them too much. At the same time, being in the better league is just better.